This webinar should now be recorded. And so thank you all for listening to our intro. Welcome again to the Emerald Ash Borer Awareness Week webinar series. Today's guest is Alexis Grinde. I actually don't know how to pronounce your last name, Alexis, who will be introducing herself and then giving a presentation for today's webinar. Alexis, I'm going to stop share on mine and you can put yours right up.
Thank you. Alexis Grinde is my...
Indeed. All right. We all learned that today then. Good.
Yeah. It's a little bit counterintuitive. Are you seeing my screen?
That looks correct. Yes.
Okay.
And you sound good.
Great. Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. My name is Alexis Grinde and I run the EAB and Ecology Lab at the Natural Resources Research Institute at the University of Minnesota. And I'm also run the Forest and Lands Research Group there as well. So I get to think a lot about forests and habitats and management and focus especially on birds, which is basically the best job in the whole wide world. I'm going to talk to you guys today about our ongoing and long-term project on EAB, focusing on black ash wetlands in Minnesota, and sort of tell you the story of how we're thinking about it, why it's important, why to really still think about EAB, even though sometimes it feels like sort of a lost cause, and why it's so important for biodiversity and what we can actually do about managing more resilient ecosystems in the future. This is research that's done in a big team, but my other co-PIs on it are Brian Palick, Tony D'Amato, and Rob Slezak from across the country, and they're wonderful and awesome collaborators. Like I said, I run the EAB and Ecology Lab, and we are 7 full-time researchers that just do a lot of different research using birds as ecosystem indicators to better understand how to manage and conserve our habitats, whether it's from a bird community kind of point of view, or we have any sort of special or endangered species that we're looking at and trying to do habitat assessments. Like I said, it's the best and coolest job, and I get to work with some really awesome scientists on a daily basis, which is really fun too. And you need that fun and you need good collaborators and employees that you're buddies with, because, you know, sometimes working in the world of natural resources and conservation, things look bleak and sad. And as we know, there's a lot of things that are changing in the world. Certainly climate change is happening at larger scales and regular intervals. In Minnesota, for example, it was 90 degrees last weekend, and then it was 30 degrees yesterday. So that's a really big swing that is not as common as, or wasn't as common as it is now. And if you think about ecosystems and how much they have to sort of adapt, and you think about migrating birds, it makes a really big deal, right? And it can have big influences on overall populations and biodiversity at large. And so we think a lot about climate threats and how that affects biodiversity. Like I said, we focus on birds, but in general, there's a global phenomena that is a decline in biodiversity across the globe, and that is occurring across all habitats. In 2019, there was a big paper that came out in Science from Rosenberg et al., looking specifically at bird populations in North America using the breeding bird survey data and other data sets as well. But basically, they showed that there has been pretty significant declines of 3 billion birds since 1970. And that's 1970 is just when we really started counting birds. And so big population declines across all sorts of habitats, including where I live in Minnesota, which is the eastern forest and the southern edge of the boreal forest. One of the highlights of the paper, though, is this wetland group, and the wetland group of bird species has actually had population increases. And that's because we did a lot of conservation and wetland management from 1970 to current times based on like ducks habitat, and a lot of different wetland species really benefited from that. And that's really the emergent kind of wetland prairie pothole region. And that's awesome, because that means if we do conservation at large scales, we can get changes in bird populations and overall positive results for biodiversity. So that's the like, yay, we can make a difference point of data that I wanted to point out. But in general, it's pretty fair to say things aren't going well when we think about biodiversity or populations of wildlife across North America. And one of the things that I think is really important is that climate change is a primary driver of biodiversity loss. And climate change depends on biodiversity as part of the solution. And so if we focus on biodiversity, we can think about how can we mitigate climate? How can we make management decisions? How can we prioritize conservation areas to really focus on overall climate resilience, ecosystem resilience. And so again, we do that through this lens of birds, but generally we think about birds as really great ecosystem indicators, because if we can conserve birds, we can conserve a lot of other things, including plants, insects at multiple scales. So today we're here to talk about emerald ash borer. I'll just give you guys a quick preview. Lee mentioned that many of you have been participating in the series of emerald ash borer, and so are probably familiar with it. But of course, it is a wood-boring beetle that is native to Asia, and it was likely introduced many decades ago at this point, but was first identified in Michigan in 2002. It attacks all native ash species that are greater than 1 inch in diameter, so pretty much any trees that get to a substantial size. Once the borer gets into the tree, it dies within 2 to 3 years because it disrupts the ability to transport nutrients. And really, we're looking at a 95% mortality within a stand. There's very few trees, at least in Minnesota so far, that seem to be resistant. But I know there are a lot of studies that are looking at some of those potentially resistant strains and seeing if that's an option for the future in terms of management. But at this point, really, the general idea is that emerald ash borer gets into a stand, all the trees are going to die. And it's just a matter of time. So we in Minnesota had the great privilege of watching emerald ash borer excuse me, spread through the east and part of Canada and now down south. And so we're just experiencing the beginnings of emerald ash borer. And so we had the privilege of starting the monitoring program. Excuse me, I'm sorry. A monitoring program before we actually had infestation. And that's unique because we were able to get all this before data. And right now we're really at the precipice of where EAB is coming into the forested wetlands. And so we're experiencing it in larger numbers. And so we were able to learn from a lot of different studies and a lot of different dynamics that have already happened out east. These are what we're the sort of systems that we're looking at. In Minnesota, we're focusing specifically on black ash, although we do have some green ash along the riparian areas. Really, we have ash, and if you don't love to like vacation in a forested swamp, that's okay. I put some pictures up just so you can see how beautiful and actually magical these systems are. And we work in a lot of forested ecosystems, and it's awesome when you sort of are in this upland area and it's all just like kind of aspen or really homogeneous, and you come into these lower lying areas and you have all these ash trees and this structure and this moisture and this pooling that's happening. It creates so much structural diversity, and then you get a lot of the biodiversity associated with it. And of course, at the right time of the year, that means a lot of bugs, and that means it's really important for a lot of different wildlife as well. So isn't that so beautiful? A lot of understory vegetation diversity as well. So again, this is the emerald ash borer where we've seen it. It's basically all throughout the eastern U.S. Here's where we have the infested counties confirmed in 36 states, District of Columbia, and 6 of the Canadian provinces. Now we're seeing it on the West Coast as of last year. When I started working with emerald ash borer and black ash systems, it was 2018. And like I mentioned, it was just sort of getting into Minnesota. And then currently it's spread despite a lot of the Don't Move Firewood campaigns. We've seen a significant spread associated with the developed areas, high use camping areas, for example. And it's in a lot of the riparian areas in the southern part of the state, but now it's definitely crept its way up into the more forested regions of Minnesota. And that's where our study takes place. And so if you're not familiar, that's the state of Minnesota. And in the Northeast region, that's all forested. It's vast amounts of trees. And we have about 1.2 million acres or a billion trees that are black ash. And so 1.2 million acres of black ash wetlands, that's a substantial amount of our overall forest composition. And it's really unique compared to other states because we have so much of it, number one. And then we also have like a very dynamic kind of system where there's some little small pockets of it that are like half an acre. And then we also have these vast 100-acre wetlands that sort of take up and are interspersed throughout the forest matrix. And so it's really amazing. And the amount of tree mortality that we expect to happen is pretty outstanding. And it's very concerning, quite frankly. And if we think about the overall forest health, not even just to black ash, but the trees that are surrounding the sort of swamped areas, how much they might experience change as well. That is why we started this study. One of the first studies that we did was published by postdoc Melissa Youngquist, and she started calling black ash a foundational species. And it was considered a foundational species because we discovered that it controls the structure and function of these sort of forested wetland ecosystems. And so essentially there's two components that a black ash is really doing in an ecosystem. One, it's controlling hydro period. And so black ash are really a weird kind of tree, and they're the last to leaf out and the first to lose their leaves. But in the meantime, they're really sucking up a lot of water. And so the hydro period it basically keeps the area from flooding. And so it might be really wet in the spring, but as the growing season goes on, it sucks up a lot of water. The other is that it has a unique carbon to nitrogen ratio. And so it makes a unique sort of litter quality that's really important for the aquatic food web, insects, and that's all the base of the food chain for all of the birds that I like to study. So we have 1.2 million acres of this foundational species that's really unique in this vast amount of area in Minnesota. We know EAB is coming. We know all these trees are going to die. We know there's not great solutions. What does this mean? How do we start thinking about this, and how do we potentially start thinking about management options? So I'll tell you the story of our research project. So we decided to set up two different study designs to look at what are the potential impacts of EAB in the system. One is in 2012, we started these experimental sites in Chippewa National Forest and Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe land. And we have, it's sort of in the middle of the state, and we have 8 different plots, and there's 4 treatments. And the treatments are a control treatment where we just retain all intact ash forest, a girdled treatment to simulate EAB mortality. And again, this is 2012, so this is before we had any EAB. And in fact, there's still no EAB in these experimental sites right now. And then we did a group selection harvest where we removed groups of ash in about 1/10 of acres to sort of make these little pockets to see if anything would regenerate if we opened up the canopy. And then we clear cut, which was sort of a preemptive harvest because a lot of people were talking about getting ash off the landscape while it was still alive and they could maybe make money on it, although there's not really a market for ash. But also, you know, this clear cut represents a potential future when we don't have ash on the landscape anymore. What's going to happen to these these wetland pockets that are no longer forested? And then also we established these 29 reference sites across the state and just looked at all the different conditions of black ash wetlands. Honestly, nobody was really studying black ash at the time. There was no data on what was really going on. Again, it's not super merchantable. It's really culturally significant for a lot of the tribes in the area, but wasn't like there was no ecological sort of studies that were focused on it. So we were just trying to figure out like, what are all the different conditions? What are the hydrology dynamics? What are there different trees that are growing in there along with black ash? What are some of the plant diversity issues that are happening? And then we also established a subset of sites where we were looking at different underplantings to see if we could get trees to grow in these different conditions. So here's just a picture of those experimental sites. Again, intact control girdle where we purposefully killed the trees to simulate EAB, the clear cut where we removed all of the trees, and then the group selection. And so we did some basic studies to sort of quantify these changes that happened over the few years. And the first thing that we looked at was hydrology. So if we remove the trees or we do group selection, or if we kill the trees, what happens compared to the control? And essentially, maybe not surprisingly, we found that there was a difference in the water tables that were pretty significant between the treatments. You remove the trees and the water stays, basically. So the wetlands get wetter and they stay wet because we don't have the trees to soak up the water. And that is a really important thing to document, and the extent of the changes in hydrology and how they change from year to year as well. One thing that was pretty exciting to know is that when we did the group selection, removed just a few trees, the hydrology stayed pretty similar to the control. So that sort of gave us some ideas that we could do some silvicultural treatments and we wouldn't get too much swamping out. And that was an important thing to document. Then the next thing that we looked at was vegetation. And so if this hydrology changes, how does the vegetation change? Again, maybe not surprisingly, we get a shift from a forested wetland condition in the controls to an emergent wetland condition or a shrubby wetland condition, depending on sort of what the surrounding landscape was. And so we would get some resprouts of black ash stumps and sedge would move in, but essentially we're changing from a forested wetland to an emergent wetland within a forest kind of matrix. Then the next thing that they wanted to look at was tree regeneration. If we remove the black ash or kill the black ash or do group selection, does anything regenerate? And the answer is basically no. These are stands that were dominated by black ash, and there's really no seed bank for any other species to kind of come in. So the replacement potential that something else will just come in and fill the niche of black ash is really poor. There are some black ash sites that do have more of a mixed species and they tend to be a little bit drier. But in general, we take black ash out of the system. There's no analog. There's nothing that's going to come in and kind of replace it. Things that we see potentially regenerating are things like balsam poplar or northern white cedar, but it is really, really site specific. So in Minnesota, there's no real like functional tree that has that same functional traits as black ash. And then one of the other tricky issues is as black ash dies and we get that swamping, there's nothing that can really establish in an emergent wetland besides those shrubs. And so you know, they came up with this idea for this adaptive strategy where we use silviculture like the group treatments plus artificial regeneration, or what I'll call underplanting, so going in and essentially planting trees in the black ash forests. One other thing that we're looking at, we have a PhD student that's doing this in a little bit more detail right now, and so there'll be a lot of results out related to it within the next year, but is the carbon. So what's the underground carbon? What is the above ground carbon? How does the EAB, how do we expect EAB to sort of affect these carbon storage areas? And again, maybe not surprisingly, if you remove the trees, you change the carbon. Then we haven't seen a ton in the below ground carbon stores yet, but again, she's sort of in the middle of analyzing a lot of that data, so more results to come very soon. Okay, so in summary, you know, years and years of study, I boiled down to like 5 slides, and I'm sure they appreciate all the work they did to be summarized that way. But essentially, we get wetlands stay wetter. We get a shift in vegetation communities from a forested wetland to emergent wetland. We get changes in ecosystem function related to carbon. And then we're also expecting a change in habitat. And importantly, there's not a tree that's just going to come in and grow if we lose some of the black ash. And so this is when I came in and we started looking at the biodiversity and started asking the question, how does this actually impact wildlife? Which I think is a pretty interesting and important thing to consider when we're talking about forest pests or climate change or whatever. And so one of the first questions that we wanted to answer was, are wildlife communities in black ash wetlands unique? So should we spend any money on conservation or restoration or management related to wildlife, or do we just get the same old forest bird community in black ash wetlands as we do in all the aspen stands or red pine stands or whatever else that we have in Minnesota? And so we did a lot of surveys in using the experimental and the reference stands. And what we found was actually honestly a little bit surprising to me. I wasn't thinking that we would see such a significant difference, but we found that the black ash communities, the bird community, sorry, in black ash forests are unique compared to the upland forest communities. So they're providing habitat for this really cool conglomeration of species. And if you're not a bird person, maybe this doesn't mean anything to you, but you can just be like, wow, those are beautiful. But brown creeper, common yellowthroat, great crested flycatcher, winter wren, these are all species that are just not found in sort of your typical homogeneous managed forest habitat. And so we did some LiDAR work and, all the habitat sort of modeling stuff. And what the important factors seemed to be in comparison to like a surrounding aspen stand was the canopy height, the canopy diversity. And so these black ash systems are sort of uneven aged, where we have natural disturbance, sort of wind openings, or they fall over because they get wet. And so we have this uneven age sort of canopy. We have a lot of understory diversity, which maybe you saw in some of the pictures. And then, of course, the water component. That water is the base of the food web for a lot of the aquatic insects. And if you're a bird that migrated all the way from Central or South America, and you're here to have babies, and you got to feed those babies, living in a place where there's a ton of food is a great idea, right? And so we got all this data to sort of show, well, oh, this species likes this particular structure, and these structures are really only available in these black ash wetlands. And was an important piece of information to sort of say, okay, well, what else do we need to know? So black ash wetlands provide this unique habitat, and in fact, we could say that they are biodiversity hotspots, and again, compositional and structural complexity for the reasons I just discussed. So then the next obvious question is, yeah, they are important. Well, how could EAB actually change these wildlife communities? And so we went to the experimental sites and we looked at all sorts of different wildlife, birds, small mammals, amphibians. We used camera traps for large mammals, medium to large mammals, and just looked at the controls versus those clear-cut conditions and saw what was using what and how different they were. And essentially what we found is that we get a complete shift in community composition for both birds and mammals, where essentially in the, intact black ash wetlands that are forested, we have the forest bird or forest mammal kind of community. And then we remove the trees, you get wetter, and we get a whole shift over into more of an emergent wetland sort of situation. And that's great because all animals are important, but unfortunately, like a lot of the bird community in these emergent wetland pockets are very similar to birds that you might hear in like a ditch in a Walmart parking lot or whatever. And so it's not a lot of high value conservation habitat. It's definitely something that you can find across the landscape a little more commonly than you can find these forested wetland conditions. And so we saw this change in both abundance and biodiversity. Importantly, this is for small mammals. We saw a decrease in abundance for the clear-cut areas, which is the likely future condition for a lot of our black ash wetlands. And that's important. Maybe people will say, well, who cares about small mammals like voles or mice or whatever, but they are the base of the food web for a lot of bigger predators that people do care deeply about. And so that is an important aspect as well. One of the other things that we found is that a lot of the forest-dependent wildlife species were avoiding the clear cut or the open areas, especially in the fall and the winter. So those cool pictures of wolf, fisher, just playing around. So they were avoiding the clear cut area. And so if you think about, there's 1.2 million acres of black ash forest in this forested landscape, and all of it's going to die, and it's all going to kind of turn to an emergent wetland. We're basically taking this beautiful intact forest and poking holes in it like Swiss cheese, right? And, in wildlife, edge effects and connectivity are really important features of forests that wildlife are responding to. So while our study couldn't necessarily address it, there are potential impacts that you can start to imagine or be concerned about related to overall wildlife populations. So, again, with my collaborators, whether we were the hydrology people, the veg people, the tree people, the wildlife people, carbon people, it's nice when you work in a big sort of holistic group and we're all like same page, overriding objective, keep the forested wetlands forested. If we don't do something, there's certainly going to be substantial consequences. And so what do we need to do to prevent this forested wetland condition from going to the emergent wetland condition as related to EAB mortality? And so we want to do that, but like, then, can you actually do anything? That is the question. Well, we know all this data. And so then you sit down and you say, well, I don't know. It feels really hard to manage 1.2 million acres. But as Ben Parker from Spider-Man says, with great power comes great responsibility. And so, of course, we have to try. We know EAB is coming, and we know this is a really important biodiversity hotspot, important for carbon storage, all this stuff. What are we going to do about it? Well, the sort of overall options were basically, if we do nothing, we just let EAB come through. We know that there's going to be negative impacts on forest-dependent wildlife in terms of both abundance and diversity. Okay, if we're willing to live with that, okay. We do know that group selection maintains wildlife communities, and so we can do some silviculture to and keep up that forested condition, and the forest-dependent wildlife will still use it. We need to determine the replacement species for black ash and figure out what the best planting strategies are. And then we also wanted to identify, well, we know we can't manage all these lands, but what can we manage and where should we manage if we were going to make the investment? So those are our next pieces of the puzzle that we're putting together, and this is still ongoing work. But one of the things that we've spent a lot of time on is finding optimal replacement species. So we know there's nothing out in the natural environment right now that will just replace black ash, but we do know that if we introduce potential replacement species, they could take off and they could seed, and we could actually keep these wetland forested, right? And so what do we know about the dynamics of the black ash stands? We do know that they're uneven age. There's canopy trees that are present during regeneration events. Their regeneration tends to happen in canopy gaps. And so that's why the group selection thing was really important. And we wanted to use a diverse plantings to just see what was actually gonna maybe grow or survive in these areas. And then they also wanted to look at climate adapted species. Of course, we don't want to do all this work and spend all this money for a species that is maybe going to just range shift due to climate change anyway. And so my collaborators had picked out this suite of species and tested how much of them survived and how much they grew. In general, the best species that we've been seeing is swamp white oak. And swamp white oak is not currently in the forested part of Minnesota, but it is, within range. But it is climate change adapted, so it can handle the heat a little bit better. It is an obligate wetland, long-lived species that currently doesn't have any pests, and so that is a species that they've been advocating for. And then balsam poplar is potentially is a species that is currently in Minnesota and these forested systems, and could potentially be a short-term replacement just to make sure some of the water is being soaked up and it doesn't essentially swamp out. So these are all published data. We also wanted to continue this, and we looked at a couple of different options and said, well, what if we don't have the money to actually do the group selections, and getting loggers into a stance in wetlands can be a really tricky business. And so what if we just plant trees? Will they survive? And so that was our phase 3 that we were just completing now. But in 2022, we planted about 4,000 trees in our phase 3 sites. We used a couple different stock sizes, small and large, and then we did some fencing, which was a real pain because bears really like push down fencing, but we thought that would help with the deer. And essentially what we found is that they do grow and they do survive without the silvicultural treatments as long as you sort of pay attention to some of the microsites. We found that browse protection wasn't really worth going out there with the fencing. It wasn't worth the cost. We didn't see a big difference in that. And this is just 2 years post-survival. And also the small stock worked pretty well too. So you don't have to have these big giant plants of trees going out into the forest. And so all of that data suggests that we can make some pretty big movement in the underplanting, again, trying to keep these forested wetlands forested, using like pretty minimally intense techniques to get the trees out into the forest. This data is going to be published soon. The other thing that we did is we developed priority areas. And so we used wildlife to do that. We used the idea that most of the wildlife responding favorably to the wetter swamps. And then also we need generally bigger areas. And so from 7,000 potential stands, we whittled it down to about 250 stands that are huge complexes that we think if we could focus adaptive management there and do some underplanting there, that we would have a pretty big impact on wildlife. So we're working with our partners to try and get some action on the ground there. And so there is sort of our priority areas. Some of these, unfortunately, over the winter have had EAB in them. So we got to move fast, which is always a challenge at any given time, but particularly this year. But hopefully we get some funding coming through and we can actually do some management this fall. And I just wanted to do a quick case study of how important this kind of work is and knowing what we know in just the basic ecology and that the system is worth saving. And it's really tempting to sort of throw up our hands and say, meh, who cares? Lift the fire bans and just let it come. There's nothing we can do about it. That is tempting, right? Because that is easy. Generally values that society has agreed upon that if we can do better, we should. And, a lot of this data allowed us to sort of go to our partners and say, here's what we think is an issue, here's what we can do about it, and get some action behind it. So this is a case study about a bird of conservation concern called the rusty blackbird. It doesn't breed in Minnesota, but it does migrate through Minnesota in really large numbers as it's going to breed in Canada, and it winters in the southern part of the US. This species has had really startling population declines since 1970 when we started tracking it. I mean, it's certainly just straight down, right? You don't need to know anything about population to know that curve doesn't look good. It loves the forested wetland. It loves a shrubby wetland, forested wetland situation. It likes to thrash around in the leaves, get all the invertebrates. They're really awesome, cool, beautiful birds. But of course, the habitats that they use, particularly as they come through Minnesota, as they stop over during migration after they breed in Canada, all of those habitats are going to be gone because of emerald ash borer. And so if you think about this habitat specialist, it's flying from Canada down to Texas. Where is it going to stop over if it doesn't have that habitat? It's not adaptable enough to just be like hanging out in a yard like your robin. It needs some habitat. So what we did is we looked at
Alexis, I'm not sure if your audio is out or mine is.